Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Thank you very much for being part of the Balkan Circle. It is our second meeting. Good evening to those of you that are on the other side of the pond. And this is our guest presenter, Jovo Miladinovic, today. Let me remind you that Balkan Circle is co-hosted by Professor Mary Newberger and myself. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm privileged to be part of the Balkan Circle, which is running for a third season and continues to provide opportunity for very interesting conversations based on academic findings from history, anthropology, political science, communication, security studies, and everything Balkan. And today my co-host is Professor Mary Newberger. Mary?
Thank you, Kirill. I'm here today with my RBG mug for people who can see it. Just want to spotlight that. So I'm a professor of history here at UT. My specialty is Bulgarian history, and I'm also the director here for our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the chair of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. I'm really excited for this talk today by Jovo Miladinovic. Jovo is affiliated with the Graduate School of Muslim Cultures and Societies at the Freie Universität Berlin, as well as the Department for Southeast European History at the Humboldt Universität Berlin. He does research in military history, social history, gender history, everyday history, and visual history, which sounds like a really fascinating combination. Jovo is currently working on a PhD project entitled Heroes, Traitors, and Survivors in the Borderlands of Empires: Military Mobilizations and Local Communities in the Sanjak from the 1900s to the 1920s. Jovo is also on the staff at the University of Constance. So we're really excited today to hear about what's going on in the Sanjak. I assume that's what your talk is about. His talk is entitled The Political and the Material, Habsburg-Ottoman Dispute over the Menschenmaterial in the post-Ottoman territories of the Kingdom of Serbia and Montenegro. Go ahead and take it away, Jovo.
Thank you. First, I would like to express my thanks to the organizers of the Balkan Circle, Mary and Kirill, for inviting me and giving me a chance to present parts of my work, albeit virtually, at the University of Texas. So before talking in detail about the Ottoman-Habsburg Dispute and relations, I want to provide additional information on the borderlands I focus on in my dissertation. So context, time period, the questions, and my main arguments. By the way, I submitted my PhD project in February, and I'm still waiting for the defense. So hopefully in October it's going to be held.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So my dissertation is entitled Heroes, Traitors, and Survivors in the Borderlands of Empires, Military Mobilizations and Local Communities in the Sanjak between the 1900s and 1920s. I situate my work at the crossroads of the new military, social, and cultural history, as well as the social history of religion. The aim is, through such a plurality, to offer a more nuanced narrative juxtaposed to the nationalistic historiographies that still depict the history of the borderlands through the black and white paradigm. Okay, what's going on? Okay, so by focusing on the Sanjak, one of many mental maps of the time, which covered the northernmost Sanjaks of the Ottoman Vilayet of Kosovo, and which prior to the Balkan Wars, 1912 and 1913, was located between the Habsburg monarchy, Serbia, and Montenegro, I wanted to conduct historical anthropological research to better grasp the military mobilization efforts situated in different scales. So until the Balkan Wars, the region was part of the Ottoman Empire. Between 1912 and 1916, it was part of Serbia and Montenegro. Between 1916 and 1918, it was a part of the Habsburg monarchy. And after 1918 onwards, it was part of the Kingdom of Serb, Slav, Croats, and Slovenes. And each of these states managed to mobilize the locals of Christian and Muslim faith into their armies or paramilitary units. So namely during the Balkan Wars and the First World War. And thus I was wondering how did they manage this? And this is important to ask because in certain cases, I followed the life trajectories of the locals who first were Ottoman soldiers, then the Serbian, then the Habsburg, or again Ottoman soldiers. So between 1916 and 1918, and finally they became Yugoslav soldiers after 1918. So depending on the time, they might be heroes or traitors in the eyes of the elites, but in my dissertation, they are survivals. So the other questions that I wanted to answer were, what are the locals' reasons for joining this or that military or paramilitary unit? What is the role of women and children in this game? And ultimately, what are the consequences of the military mobilizations for the societal fabrics? So on the spot. So the military mobilizations represented only a small piece of a much larger puzzle through which big questions such as state and nation building, the question of loyalty, hegemonizing campaigns, accommodations under a new regime could be answered. So in order to provide these answers, the project draws on the multilingual repertoire of archival and visual sources, chronicles, travelogues, and ego documents of different origin and type. The governments could define the boundaries of the Sanjak differently, seeking to construct and refine the space locally. They try to overshadow the local perspectives of speciality and impose their epistemological categories because they saw the locals through the confessional and national labels. But they overlooked other forms of horizontal and vertical loyalties that were equally important for the people. So the number of the locals prior to 1912 was around 250,000, consisted of bilingual, in some cases even multilingual, Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, and Muslims. So even thought these polities perceived the locals through the clear-cut lenses. I didn't want to concern myself with one isolated group, because as Stephen Siegel argues in his work, who is today with us, so I conceptualizing them as units exclusive to each other does not leave much room for borderline complexity and plural modes of belonging. So this is also unfeasible given the many shared links that bonded the people. But the issue for the elites and the preachers of nationalism was they could not fully categorize the Sanjak and the locals based on their linguistic or ethnographic categories, which represented the sole tool for designating the ethnographic boundaries of imagined communities. They tried to codify the locals according to their everyday clothes, but in vain, since in many parts of the region, the locals of different faith wore the same clothes. Meaning that for the outsiders, it was utterly hard to determine who is who. I do not want to romanticize the locals or to claim that people do not identify themselves in the national sense. Not all saw themselves in such a way. That was my argument. So the mixed clothes and bilingualism or multilingualism represented a serious issue for the nationally minded elites and the preachers of nationalisms, for which reason a Yugoslav scholar after 1918 labeled those who wore Albanian outfits as ethnic mimicry. Their Albanian peers, called Albanian speakers, who were donned in the half Slavic costume and knew the Slavic vernaculars as Meljezi or bastards. So to rephrase the words of Homi Baba, they were almost Albanians or Serbs, but not quite, since being partial means being incomplete and being nationally indifferent in the eyes of the elites means being half civilized. The Sanjak should not be understood as a one unified borderland, but rather consisted of various borderlands. So instead of simplifications furthered by the elites, one sees the complexities, different societal fabrics, and the landscapes with which the locals identify themselves. These represented a local system of action, status, influence, and authority, having been to some extent remote from the outside, whereby they constituted a distinct sphere of perception and information. Equally important was their moral economy towards the inside and outside. But why is it important to reconstruct the locals' worldviews and what this has to do with the military mobilizations? I took an outward perspective and adopted a view from within the borderlands. So seeking to understand as many aspects of a particular space as possible, I wanted to emphasize multidimensional knowledge by not essentializing the area, although any choice of the latter is not neutral. So through their localities, histories, activities, coexistence, and production of spaces, I sought to overcome the closed space and counterweight imposed epistemologies. So the locality one is coming from defines, even in some cases, the length of military service under Ottoman rule. So thus the region itself is composed of various spaces on this map, allowed me a comparative and relational context. So my initial hypothesis was that the state's military mobilization efforts, which aptly concealed various hidden transcripts of the elites, cannot be explained only by highlighting the national and confessional figures. The military mobilization efforts were aimed at facilitating the transition of borderlands as place where societal boundaries were blurred to bordered land, where fixed national hierarchizations and the management of resources in the hands of the elites were achieved. I tried to show that this was not one-dimensional process, as different locals hampered this transition. Their actions had to be explained by specifying the social inference in immediate settings, including the social worlds that set the boundaries of their sense-making. So to give a more nuanced narrative of the military mobilizations, I paid heed to other drafting tools that combined with the national or confessional loyalties, for example, and gendered a powerful pulling force on the locals. It is pivotal to be mindful of language communities, networks, worldview self-interpretations, national confessional ideological drafts, particular loyalties, age, gender, and local standings. So these pre-war socializing filters played an important role in understanding the agency, intention, the life role of the locals before, during, and after war. By drawing on the work of Norbert Elias and Pierre Bourdieu, I thus conceptualized the state-backed military mobilizations as a field in which the various actors who possess different forms of capital interacted in order to break the state-society dichotomy and to highlight the interdependence of the all involved players, also of those who did not end up serving under the banner. So by paying particular attention to actors in the field, it is apparent that the locals also were capable of self-mobilization and understand the context in which they found themselves. So this enhanced their bargaining chip vis-a-vis the state. So this military mobilization field pushed the actors to constant negotiations, and their interrelation facilitated the mobilizations. In some cases, the locals were acting from asymmetric positions. However, by negotiating, they achieved a better deal. Mobilizations could be launched from the top, but the preparatory part was always difficult, since it required the actors to sacrifice their present forms of capital in favor of uncertain future benefits. Therefore, the governments had always to invest and reinvest into what David Edelstein calls the strategies of inducement, land issues, tax, debt, and social welfare policies, in order to underpin compliance, loyalty, and tacit societal contracts with the able-bodied locals and their families. So through the mobilization field, I could also trace how the state powers were diffused and how they did not act always together, since dispute between the officers or between the military and bureaucratic fields are evident. Yet in reference to the military mobilizations, these powers were able to find a common language. So when one combines the strategies of inducement, the ideological strategies, the coercive methods with the local consent, it becomes clear that the state's mobilization efforts never revolved around one strategy. Instead, it was the interdependent mobilization tools that yielded the result, whose numbers in a way corresponded with time, space, and local idiosyncrasies, as well as with the expectations of the locals. Even if the locals were nationalized or radicalized in the meantime, in some cases, the strategies of inducement were necessary because through the material, they better understood the political, so to say, of ideology. So one therefore cannot name the factor that incites the locals to act, but the answer rather lies in the independent movement of various dynamics. So while playing together, they work that facilitate a powerful effect, although with different weights. And methodologically, it's unfeasible to gauge which one weighted more compared to the other. This might sound too abstract for you. So I believe that by giving one episode from the First World War, you would better understand what I'm talking about. So in the dominant historiographical perception of the Habsburg occupation, the context of Serbia and Montenegro, the Habsburg monarchy was perceived as the only dominant actor locally, and the roles of victims and oppressors were usually fixed. Here on this Ottoman map, so the Habsburg monarchy occupied the western parts of Serbia. So here is the line, Montenegro and Albania, and whereas the Habsburg World War I Bulgarian ally occupied the eastern parts of Serbia, the most parts of today's Kosovo, and also, in a way, the whole North Macedonia, so to say. Although the monarchy occupied the borderlands, their Ottoman ally also exerted pressure through various actors, whereby the Ottoman government looked at its lost Balkan provinces as an area where compensation of the so-called human material, the term that is used so often in sources, was attainable. So namely, these were the actors with whom the Habsburg authorities were forced to wrestle over the control of the local populations and influential representatives. So who sought actually to enhance their social economical position, which had been shaken during the Serbian-Montenegrin occupation, so between 1912 and 1916. Accordingly, the existence of multiple actors within an occupied territory who had contradictory goals caused the task of occupation to become increasingly difficult. So during this interplay, the Muslim population of the borderlands emerged as an imagined object that had to be mobilized. Thus, the occupation created a social field within which countless actors confronted each other from symmetrical and symmetrical positions, which led to negotiations and competition between them. This context has enabled the simultaneous shaping and reshaping of the very conditions of domination and occupation. Yet the Habsburg-Ottoman mutual interaction created an environment in which the military mobilization of the locals into the armies of the Central Powers took place. Although alliances on the outside appeared as a homogeneous bloc, their key nuances resurfaced due to the opposing war aims. What were the goals of the Habsburg monarchy and the Ottoman Empire? How did their relations spill over into the region and spread among the locals? Who were the actors locally, and what were their goals? While addressing these questions, one must pay heed to other regions, such as Dobruja in Romania or post-Ottoman Macedonia, where actors of these polities participated, thereby eliciting the inner and outer context in which they found themselves. In short, it's about globalizing and localizing the First World War, as the region cannot be considered as being isolated from other areas. Local social change is a dynamic process associated with wider fluctuations. War aims should not be understood as static, but rather as being reflected, developed, and modified given their conflict-driven dynamic. Thus, the Habsburg and Ottoman war goals constantly changed, making the lust for conquest undeniable and affecting the former Ottoman Balkan territories as well. Scholars have already demonstrated how both civilian and military elites in Vienna and Budapest pursued expansionist policies aimed at obtaining and increasing the territorial, economic, and military power of the monarchy. In line with Germany, the Habsburg war aims were more offensive, whereby the ruling power spent considerable time debating the future of the occupied territories. The permanent antagonism between the Habsburg military and civil authorities was mirrored on the ground, affecting the occupying administrations in Serbia, Montenegro, and Albania, in which the main question revolved around annexation or protectorate. Besides maintaining diplomatic envoys in Sarajevo, The Ottoman Empire employed its esteem among the locals through a liaison officer appointed at the German army group in Bulgaria-occupied Skopje, a Belgrade-based official for the protection of Ottoman subjects and interests, certain notables and Ottoman soldiers in the borderlands themselves. So the notables, for instance, hoped that the region would be yielded back to the Sultan. Though some scholars claim that the taking back former provinces did not appear prominently among the initial war aims of the Ottoman Empire, irredentism and calls for revenge in the post-1913 setting became commonplace, as myriad studies on the topic have demonstrated. Take, for instance, this map produced by the Balkan Kojiro associations, established in the Ottoman Empire after the Balkan Wars. So you see how they painted the former Ottoman Balkan provinces succeeded to the former Balkan allies in black, and how they enlisted the names of towns and localities they are coming from. So here is, for instance, Tashlija, Plevlja, here is Yeni Pazar, Novi Pazar, here is Kosova, and here is Manastir. So labeling the map intikam, or revenge in Ottoman Turkish, tells a lot. So this is not to say that the redrawing of the political borders was the most dominant and leading factor that pushed the Ottoman Empire into the First World War. Rather, its presence cannot be easily ignored, not least because the later made changing the political map feasible. Not to mention the family background of most of the ruling Ottoman military elites at the time, who hailed originally from the Balkans, and whom Erik Jan Tsuha refers to as children of the borderlands. Growing up in the Ottoman Balkans, for instance, strongly shaped the worldview of travelers who published their accounts of the region in the late Ottoman period or in the time of early Republican Turkey. Despite the friendship narrative that dominated the Habsburg public space, material assistance, and the sending of Habsburg soldiers to the empire, it was the successful campaigns of the Central Powers in the Balkans in late 1915 and 1916, and the subsequent occupations of Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, and Romania, which revealed how the war aims quickly evolved among the allies. They also illustrate how the opposing goals between the allies could hamper the alliance. Although competition between various Habsburg powers within the military and political field was palpable, what homogenized these fractions and guided them to act in unison was the possible encroachment of another foreign power in the Habsburg backyard, that is, the occupied territories. The problem between the Habsburg monarchy and the Ottoman Empire stemmed from the misinterpretation of the 1914 peace treaty signed between the Kingdom of Serbia and the Ottoman Empire, so which enabled both sides to claim that the locals were Serbian, Montenegrin, or Ottoman subjects. Once the Ottoman government declared war on Serbia in late 1914, Belgrade declared the treaty invalid. According to it, the former Ottoman inhabitants of Muslim faith became Serbian subjects. However, they had a period of 3 years to state whether they wanted to remain under Ottoman subjecthood. Thus, the Serbian military could not draft or impose any military levy on its Muslim subjects until March 1917. But alas, the Ottoman government declared a war on Belgrade. Still, the Ottoman side kept referring to the treaty and demanded in late 1916 that the fit Muslims be sent to the Romanian front as a support for the Ottoman army, because the Ottoman army, the Ottoman Empire also participated in the campaign against Romania in late 1916. So the question of subjecthood offered the Ottoman government the perfect excuse to meddle in the work of their Habsburg ally, all while seeking to strengthen its influence on the locals, who had also become part of this interplay after they were informed of the matter by the Ottoman actors. The Habsburg civil and military parts disagreed at first on this topic. However, at the end, they agreed that it was in the best interest of the monarchy to preserve the Albanian-speaking population, give it its self-image of being a friendly country towards the Albanians, and the alleged propensity towards war or martial race of the imagined Albanian, because they really believe that Albanians are like the best war material for the war. They agreed in late 1916 that Slavic and Turkish-speaking prisoners of war of the Serbian army and the locals from the borderlands who voluntarily joined in could be deployed as reinforcement of the Ottoman troops, excluding the Albanians. So in doing so, the Habsburg authorities sought to preserve absolute control over the occupied areas. Even if this decision clearly violated the Hague Convention, the Habsburg authorities justified this action by referring to the Russian and Serbian examples, which had already established units composed of the Slavic-speaking Habsburg prisoners of war in Russia. And the Serbian government, for instance, used these Habsburg subjects in the campaign against, during the Romanian campaign against the Habsburg monarchy, and this backfired on them. So defiant at any possible encroachment that mitigate its hegemony, the Habsburg power soon realized that the so-called Young Turco propaganda, which was active on the ground, had openly showed its aspiration. Its representatives were the locals from the occupied zones, among whom some served in the Ottoman army, and whose goal was to incite the population to demand that an Ottoman prince be appointed to the Albanian throne. The recruitment was not stopped, but the Habsburg authorities still did not want their Ottoman ally to gain a foothold among the Albanian-speaking locals, who, in their eyes, became the primary recipients of this propaganda. That this was not exaggeration shows the reaction of the Bulgarian authorities in occupied Macedonia. They had reached the same conclusion. Therefore, the Ottoman power sought to enhance its influence in occupied Macedonia, whose clandestine aim, according to the Bulgarian side, was territorial compensation in Thrace and gaining a foothold in the northern parts of Dobruja, a Romanian province occupied by Germany at that time. So it is evident that the Habsburg side tended to place more stress on the political. However, behind this stance, the material driving reasons also existed, meaning that one must look beyond the propaganda narrative and focus on the interplay between the two. Scholars have already revealed how, for instance, in the context of the American Civil War, parties made maximal use of what the private called the stuff of war, referring to the materials needed for waging and winning the war. The soldier's body belonged to the realm of the stuff of war and emerges a material entity which military powers plan to exploit. Since numbers do matter, quantity has a qualitative aspect that should not be ignored in times of war. The First World War was perceived as a material battle in which an undrafted subject became a unit of a resource. This background also led to disputes over the human material that should be defined as either a struggle for power or a struggle for control over resources due to its scarcity. Having faced the negative outcomes of the loss-making war, the Habsburg authorities realized that the borderlands held valuable human material that could be harvested. Even during peacetime, recruits, and especially retired recruits, became a factor in the economical calculations of the state budgets, whose physical deficiencies, along with sick recruits, were perceived as an economic problem because they were of no use. Regular annual recruitments are qualified as one of the real and solid foundations through which the elites can solidify themselves on the ground, because they have given them the opportunity to learn more about their subjects. By becoming a docile body, the recruit became something that could be shaped and transformed. The body was seen as a valuable material or element, how they used also in sources, that must be protected from enemies or bad weather conditions, whose quality needs to be increased through training. So in this example, one follows the conjuncture between politicization and economization of human life, because the spread of economic rationalization to all areas of life has necessarily radicalized political economy into biopolitical economy. So the attempt maritime blockade forced the Habsburg monarchy and the other members of the Central Powers to look for the much needed materials, and the direct and indirect outcomes of this blockade can be seen not only in the region in reference to the human reservoir as a local recourse in the post-war period, but also in the occupied Belgium, Russian, Romanian territories, not to mention Ottoman Syria. Ultimately, the decision of the issue concerning who would receive the crucial materials took a considerable amount of time. Yet the human material should not only be regarded in strict military terms, since its image changes depending on the context, and even becoming the political in the sources. This meant that the Habsburg authorities wanted to use the imagined Albanian community as a leverage in future peace or post-war negotiations. Not only could over-harvesting turn the Muslim Sanjak into a pure Serbian province, but the locals might also consider the monarchy as someone that furthered the Serbian policy of extermination of the Muslims, end of quote. This was necessary since the reservoir was pretty much exhausted by mid-1917 and caused problems because the mood of the locals has declined significantly. Therefore, future recruits could only be enlisted with great tensions and difficulties. The Ottoman side also searched for this material and cast the net of conscription as wide as possible over the empire in an attempt to replenish its rank and file by constantly modifying existing recruitment laws during the First World War. In particular, the Gallipoli campaign, which ended at the outset of 1916, and violence against its own subjects within the empire, drained the available pool of reservoirs to such a degree that the Ottoman army would never be able to overcome the shortage in manpower through the rest of the war, as one scholar writes. It therefore comes as no surprise that the Ottoman delegate in the Habsburg monarchy uttered, "We urgently need soldiers at the moment," asking for a permit that a military commission could conduct recruitments in the borderlands. To seize any fit local, the Ottoman government wielded holy war as a pretext to enlist Iranians, Egyptians, North Africans, and Albanian Slavic-speaking Muslims who lived in the Ottoman Empire. So the inner context made the government go beyond the empire's borders and turn them not only to the inhabitants of the occupied regions, but also to those living in Habsburg, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Holy war, images portraying the Sultan as caring deeply for the Muslims, and the politics of benevolence, sending foodstuffs for Ramadan in the Habsburg and the Bulgarian occupied territories, were wielded as the Ottoman strategies of inducement, which were meant to help achieve their goals. Having been conceptualized as part of the governmental rationality, these strategies must be regarded as a form of activity aiming to shape, guide, and affect the conduct of some persons. But these must occur in an environment that is stable and secure enough so that these strategies were not overshadowed by the pressure of subduing unrest and restoring order. Since occupation initializes pressure for acting due to the private reasons and engulfing uncertainty, the locals are often directly or indirectly occupier-driven. So thus the loyalty is subject to change. In such a context, subjective normality assumptions become dubious, reliability corrodes, expectations and routines are uncertain, while the feelings of vulnerability are spread. Their regulations are massively threatened and are severely under stress. So launching the strategies of inducement do not automatically mean that the locals would rush to enlist. By offering a tested security contract from uncertainties of all kinds, the authorities tended to uphold the state loyalty and control over the locals. The Habsburg authorities in Montenegro emphasized it was the duty of the monarchy to ensure the protection of the war volunteers against possible post-war prosecutions who frequently discredited themselves in public. Believing that this decision would stimulate their interest into the army, an optional settling in Habsburg, Bosnia and Herzegovina was offered in late 1916 to those who came from the borderlands. So therefore, the aim was to protect them and their families from any possible Montenegrin and Serbian post-war persecutions. In all, recruitment was carried out with a combination of force methods, burning the houses of those who did not want to join in, financial assistance, offering money, salary, food before and after entering the military, social welfare programs, not only for the war volunteers, but also for the members of their immediate families, and with the support of local notables. The fact that the dispute between the Habsburg and Ottoman allies affected the locals is shown in the case of the detention of Ali Begovic, a trader and member of the most noble and richest family, and a quote from Novi Pazar. The local Habsburg authorities arrested Ali Bey in mid-1917 under the charges of committing espionage, conducting Ottoman propaganda, and cajoling the locals to join the Ottoman army instead of joining to the Habsburgs. In a number of cases, the Ottoman envoy from Belgrade even succeeded to steal the Habsburg precious cargo or force the Habsburg authorities to cancel the shipment of the locals into the Habsburg army. It is therefore unsurprising that the Habsburg authorities suggested passive resistance vis-a-vis the Ottoman envoy, meaning that authorities were supposed to reduce interactions with him to the lowest level possible. No matter how much this situation resembled a dead end, a provisional solution was reached, favored the Habsburg side. The Ottoman government agreed that the question over the subjecthood should be postponed until after the war. Although the Habsburg government firmly defended its stance of not allowing anyone to recruit the locals except of their own power, the authorities eventually permitted the Ottoman side to send a recruiting commission to the borderlands. However, problems emerged as soon as Subhi Bey, who headed the commission, arrived in Mitrovica in late 1917. Not only did military factors drive the commission, but also the political ones, not least because, according to the Habsburg local authorities, Subhi Bey's chief task was to pave the way for the ideas of the young Turk. This meant increasing sentiment locally in favor of the Ottoman Empire for the creation of an autonomous Albania under an Ottoman prince. It was for this reason that the Muslim people and notables did not absolutely want to know a single thing about it, and they were very unpleasant to him. He also made a lot of problems to the Bulgarian occupying authorities in Skopje. But where the Habsburg authorities saw peril, others recognized a chance to act more independently, which meant not all notables were against Subhi Bey's actions. In the context of the town of Mitrovica, the Draga brothers, Neji Bey and Ferhat Bey, were identified as the main conduit of the Ottoman activities. The Ottoman Commission managed to enlist locals by relying on their vigorous support, who had furthered an anti-Habsburg policy due to economical reasons. The brothers used the Commission's presence to strengthen their status and exert pressure on the Habsburg power. They were not on good terms with Hasan Bey Pristina and Derizhvej Omerovic, about whose politics and descendants we heard last week in the interesting presentation of Vasiliki Neophotistos. So influential actors who also belong to the local elites, who emerged in this context as the opponents of the Draga brothers because their goals overlapped with that of the Habsburg monarchy. So each of these actors secretly hoped to be dominant locally. Since military mobilizations equally empowered local elites, these actors possessed local knowledge, owned different types of capital, and were strongly interlinked with the locals, whose interests they had to consider, as well as with the governments. Precisely because of that, they were very important in the mobilization process, and depending on the context, they could act against the occupying authorities. So these actors are labeled in the scholarship as military brokers, entrepreneurs, or corporate players, and should not be seen as a monolithic group running back and forth between the state and community, since their boundaries change depending on time, space, and local idiosyncrasies. Since they were aware of their importance, the state would allow them to maintain their undefined rules to a certain extent. So they had a shared interest in preserving the framework that made or maintained their status. And for this reason, some were ready to negotiate with the new state in order to protect their localities, which functioned as a base. So this does not surprise that the Draga brothers were very close with the Serbian, government. So here the mutuality lays between themselves and the state, because the governments, despite being able to apply coercive measures, which might not yield results, it could only instigate disorder, usually offered a tacit trade-off: tax economic benefits, opening new businesses, privileged trade contracts, as in the case of Draga brothers, for instance, in the time of the Habsburg occupation. As soon as these contracts were canceled, one notices the change in their behavior vis-a-vis the Habsburg monarchy: collection of taxes, bribe, participation in local governance. So power holders in Mitrovica realized that the Habsburg occupation could be used not only for personal enrichment, because the military mobilization was viewed as a kind of lucrative business, for instance, extorting money from those who wanted to avoid recruitment, but also for eliminating local competitors. The Draga brothers, using their connections with the Bulgarian occupying forces, arranged Hassan Bey to be arrested while he was visiting Skopje. So in this context, political differences were not dominant, but personal ambitions. So the connection of the locals in some contexts with the corporate persons was not based on politics, but on family or similar motives. Due to this unstable and suspicious behavior, the Habsburg authorities arrested Ferhat Bey. So also they limited the brothers' influence among the locals by maintaining good relations with Hassan Bey and Dervish Bey and their bases. So since the recruitment was finished, a photo session with the volunteers followed, which was most likely taken in the front of the former governor's building and was published in Istanbul in a military periodical. So although the faces on the right photo are hard to identify given the quality of a photo, one can clearly see in the first line of men, so 2 Ottoman officers surrounded not only by the war volunteers, but also by the military brokers. I know for other sources that on this picture, one can find Neji Bey, Ferhat Bey, so the Draga brothers, Hassan Bey, and Dervish Bey. Above them, there stands an Ottoman flag, together with the bodies, and presence of the Ottoman officers. They symbolize an authority, giving a patriotic color to the event, establishing, if only for a moment, the appearance that the Ottoman Empire had returned. So this staging is also very important because it implies a tendency of the state to construct military mobilization in public as a kind of festival in which the able-bodied both knowingly and voluntarily participate. So the Yugoslav elites used the picture in the 1920s as evidence in a court trial against Ferhat Bey Draga, precisely because it depicted the recruitment of the local volunteers. The dispute notwithstanding, the actions of the Ottoman Empire in its former Balkan provinces delivered some results because, according to an official post-war Ottoman report, it acquired almost 50,000 soldiers between 1916 and 1918. So the number can be much higher because the number of those enlisted for both the Habsburg and Ottoman armies from occupied Serbia and Montenegro was around 35,000 men. So it is unclear how much the Habsburg side gained from these actions. Reaching an exact number is complicated because the Ottoman authorities tended to conceal the numbers and the names of the war volunteers under the pretext that this might stop their influx into the Ottoman Empire. Thank you for your attention.
Bravo, Jovo. I am fascinated, for one, since you've touched on so many topics that are of my personal interest. This was a really good, very thought-provoking presentation, which I'm sure will have an excellent discussion because at least some of the big questions which you've put actually in a historical perspective, which are not usually thought of as connected necessarily to the borderlands and the Balkans, are kind of key, and those would be my opening remarks. Since you talked about the push and pull factors and, in essence, marketization of military skills, and how this process of marketization actually goes through different stages. Anywhere from a desired commodity, a process of human resources, an able body, as you mentioned, as a commodity that needs to be protected, sheltered, and given special preference, all the way to what I say weaponizing draft. So in essence, a coercive instrument. And in between, which I find fascinating as a political scientist, all of those bargaining mechanisms of individual, what today I believe we call in modern theory, when we deal with private warfare, it's like military enterprisers in essence, which operate as not only recruiters, but they have wider social functions. So it is fantastic how we're looking at this overlap, and of course the changing loyalties, which inadvertently change identities. So my just remark and question first, just to open the discussion, would be about this common marketization or making the able fighting body into a commodity, what would be the nadir point in this period that you consider? I think you've outlined and gave some ideas, but what are the worst instances of this process, in your opinion? Thank you.
Should I collect the questions or should I right away answer to it?
Please, start and we'll collect the questions. Next is my co-host, and then the questions are already coming.
So thank you for the remark, comment, and also the question. I don't know whether I rightfully understand the question, so please be open and tell me if my answer satisfies your question. So the problem is that in the literature, there is still dominant reading that the military mobilizations can be analyzed from the perspective of the elites and the perspective of recruits. But in between, there is a much happening. It does not mean that the end is, as I said, the idea of mobilizing people can come from the top, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be achieved at the end. So I wanted to see what's happening in between. Who are the persons who are engaging and who are involved in this process? Who is Ferhat Beydraga? What's with his family? Why he's so important? Why other persons? The number of persons, why they're important? Because notables are not the only one who were engaged. There is teachers, there is paramilitary leaders, veterans. Who else? Of course, clergymen, bandits. And this is important because the boundary between all these actors are not fixed, because teacher can be, as we know from the case of Ottoman and Macedonia, they can be also paramilitary leaders. Bandits are very good connections with the notables. Through their kin, they are also entangled with clergymen. And so on and so forth. So I wanted actually to analyze how this military mobilization in the context of the Sanjak worked. I don't think that this was answer to your questions.
No, actually, it did address it. I was just fascinated by the extremes, that you were saying, as in extracting maximum benefits, if you will, and on one side, and then unfortunately suffering the coercion at the worst.
Because
so this is.
I really wanted to see who is benefiting, who benefits from the military mobilizations, and who suffers. Is the released soldiers suffers because they also have benefits? Their family members also have benefits, because, for instance, the Habsburg social welfare policy, it was unbelievable. The Ottomans have a similar policy, the Serbs, Montenegrins, and so forth. But the Habsburg policies was so extent because it was not only about immediate family members, but also the large households are going to be
extended. Yes.
So and this was fascinating for me because they know. This is also important to say. So the governments do not apply the same policies in every part of the region. If they know that in certain cases strategies of inducement are going to be sufficient, they're not going to apply violence or coercive methods. In some areas, when you see that the locals are going to say, yeah, well, the strategies of inducement are important, but then you will see the elites are going to say, look, this is it. If you don't accept it, we are going to burn your house. We are going to take your.
You've just answered my question. So it's a mix.
And then in some cases, you see the overlapping between the coercive methods, the consent, which doesn't mean that this consent is a religious or national motivated, and also these coercive methods. This is something also what I see, for instance, in the Kingdom of Serbia prior to the Balkan Wars. Not everyone, run to the front. Because in some cases they do have a large number of peasants who said, I don't have an interest to go into war. What is my interest here? And in that case, you need to negotiate. You need constantly negotiate, investing, reinvesting, applying various actors. If they do not succeed, then you need to apply another method. So yeah, in a sum,
Thank
that was.
you. Thank you very much. No, very extensive. Miri.
Oh, well, I think let's go to our guests first for questions, and then I will ask questions later. But and Stephen, we'll get to your question too. But Nuri has his hand up. Yay, Nuri! I'm so happy to see you here. Welcome. Wait, you're muted.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. I hope you are all doing well. Well, Jovo, I hope that this is how your name is pronounced.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's not
So,
Jovo.
I do have a question to you because I'm originally coming from the southern part of Bulgaria, and I know that during the Gallipoli campaign, we have many people who volunteered from Kırjali region, especially to go to war on the side of the Ottoman Empire because they identify themselves as Turks, even among the Pomak minority of the country. Then when it comes to Sanjak, I wonder if there are some people, because especially in central Anatolia and also other parts of Turkey, there are some people and families who put henna on their sons, saying that they actually sent not soldiers, but those to be sacrificed for the country, for the future of the country. I don't know if there are certain type of events in the Sanjak region, because I didn't hear what you said, but still I know that many people from this region, especially even though some of them working right now at the University of Belgrade, when they do self-identify themselves as Turks, I don't see that type of connection, but they do have many histories, I mean, personal histories to tell. So I don't know if you met some type of such type of examples from this part when you were doing your research.
Thank you, Nuri, for your question and comment. Actually, I did. I mean, there is examples from the Sanjak who also, I mean, traveled to the Ottoman Empire. Also, this was very, I mean, it's hard to explain because at that time, so until the late 1915, the Sanjak was still the part of Montenegro and Serbia. So the traveling was also very hard. I mean, how you're going to travel because I mean, Serbia, Montenegro is the enemy of the Ottoman Empire. But there is such cases. There is such cases, and you're totally right. I mean, in the Ottoman archives, there is a lot really about the war volunteers from Bulgaria, from Romania, traveling all the way to Istanbul. They all used network with the Ottoman consuls in Sofia, also in the various Romanian cities. But this was also problematic because how are you going to travel? Are you going to travel to Serbia or going to travel by the Danube? And then, I mean, to Istanbul. In the cases of Hannah, no, I did not, I mean, encountered such examples because this is fascinating. I mean, this is really fascinating.
Yeah, because we have like many cases where I was doing my research here, especially from central Anatolia, that are very common, and also from the Thrace, eastern Thrace region of Turkey. When you see 12, 13 years old boys sent from their families to the war front, and they were put especially the henna, because, you know, in the tradition, before you sacrifice the animal during the Eid period, you have to put henna on it, saying that symbolizing the sacrifice, I mean, how it takes place. So they put on their sons when they're sending them to the army and for the war, and saying that I actually sacrificing my son for the country or for our nation. This was the meaning of that. And you are right, because we know that during the Gallipoli campaign, which was the harshest, I mean, period of the war, most soldiers who died in the war were from Bursa or from Istanbul. The first was Bursa, second Istanbul area region, or vilayet, let's say, because Bursa is called as different, I mean, called at that time. But we know that this was logistical reasons.
No, because I mean, there is different contexts in which the war volunteers are going to mobilize. This is only one. I mean, there is those who are, you know, willingly are going to travel, and because they want to become war volunteers. But the category of war volunteers is also dubious. And the elites know this. They use this very knowingly, because in the case of the Hague Convention, for instance, because if you show something that is willingly, then you're saying we don't have nothing to do with this. This is the willingly, this is the locals which you do, because in that case there is like a loop between the legal and what also the elites are going to construct.
Thank you so much.
So Stephen, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
It's more of a factual question. I'll leave it to the audience for now, if the audience has more substantial questions. I was just interested, great presentation. I learned so much from you. I wanted to recommend Kate Imey's book, Faithful Fighters, which is really interesting about the British Imperial Army and the recruitment of Indian soldiers. This won a prize and it was published by Stanford last year. I was curious about the quotas. If you found in the Ottoman Empire, again, like comparing regions, if the recruiters and recruiting commissions had been sent number of bodies, especially in the context and then after Gallipoli. That was my question.
Thank you, Stephen, for the suggestion and for the question. Unfortunately, I don't have answer on your question, because I was also trying to find out, the quota according to the region, and whether I will, because this is important for me when it comes to the post-war settings. Okay, what is the consequences of the military mobilizations? Because, for instance, in the nationally minded historiographies are going to say, I mean, during the Habsburg occupation, a lot of Muslims, the number of Muslims is going up. This is wrong. I mean, it's going really down. And I was asking myself, okay, is it possible maybe, to gauge the number? I mean, when it comes to the certain landscapes, localities, no, unfortunately not, because I think that I did my best, when it comes to digging, but unfortunately not.
It's really hard. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, so I have to decide which one to ask, but also a few comments. So one, were you at the talk last year of Hari Menasidis, who's my student right now, PhD student here at UT? If not, I just want to put you in touch with him, because he's actually working on Greek-Turkish mobilization, and particularly the issue of mobilization.
Charalampos.
No, Menasidis. Yeah.
Charalampos.
Yeah.
We know each other.
Okay, good.
Yeah, we know each other.
In that same period, which, he talks about it as the war decade, which I had never really thought of before. But if you think about it, there really is kind of continuous war, more or less from 1912 to 1922 in the Balkans, depending on which part you're in. But it's a period which, I realize the more I learn about it, the more, and today I learned a lot, the more I realize that there's so much I don't know, because it's so complicated and chaotic, but a lot of side switching, during those wars, like alliances changed, but also who was mobilized into which armies changed. And so I'm fascinated by the idea that there's probably certain individuals and groups who got mobilized, maybe multiple times into multiple armies over that period.
Also families.
And families.
One son is in one army, another is another. I mean,
which it totally shows the complexity of this whole area really as a borderland. I mean, we can think of the Sanjak in particular as a borderland, but it's really one big borderland in so many ways. So I'm just, kudos to you. You really get to the complexity of it in this area, and I think also bring out the agency of all these different groups, instead of just sort of assuming that the states are kind of deciding and manipulating. We get to see how much local actors are involved. So sorry, go ahead. You can.
No worry. I just want to say, I mean, when I zoom in actually on particular localities, I'm fascinated how certain local actors outsmarted these empires. I really enjoy such moments. I mean, this is very subjective what I'm saying. I mean, and also, for instance, the Habsburgs, they were convinced that the polarization between the Christians and Muslims is done. I mean, we achieved this. I mean, there is like hierarchization. And they were so wrong after 1918. I mean, in certain areas you are able to follow polarization, but this not has something to do with the Habsburg occupation per se, but the other settings, other dynamics are at play. But in some areas you will, there is a small urban town called Plevlja, Tashlija. I mean, the town between 1912 and 1918 witnessed 6 different occupations. And each of these occupations had, continuous these nationalizing heroicization campaigns. And you will see how the Christians and the Muslims are going to stick together, despite everything. This does not mean that in the same area you can find this, the nationally minded persons, but they know that if they do something wrong, the situation is going to change because they do not know what tomorrow is going to bring. And they, it's particularly in early 1920s, they still expect something's going to happen. Another war will come. And in this case, this is very fascinating because this ancient hatred, this does not work here. This does not mean that I'm trying to romanticize the relations.
No, I totally agree. There's so much pragmatic and there's so much about the historical moment, the contingency of the moment. And, of course, in the Bulgarian case, the first Balkan War was waged as kind of a holy war, but the second Balkan War, the Bulgarians needed the Muslims on their side and they needed them on their side in World War I. So that kind of turned on a dime, it really had to. I was fascinated that you brought up clothes in the beginning, because I don't know if you know, in my first book, I have a couple chapters where I write a lot about clothes.
Yeah, I know about vests. I find it fascinating.
There's a lot about hats and headwear, veils, headscarves, fezes, turbans, and shalvar. So I'm just kind of wondering, I want to hear more about the clothes angle. So they were looking at what people were wearing to try and figure out who they were.
Yeah, definitely. And this is hard for the elites. Before 1912, it's hard to determine who is Muslim, who is Christian, because they assume, this fancy Ottoman stuff about, Muslims are going to be donned in a particular color or something like that. Come on. But this is interesting. For instance, what we today understand as the national clothes, let's code it like Serbian or Albanian. At that time, it was clothes that was used by Christians or Muslims. Plis or Čeleš, the typical Albanian hat, what is today a typical Albanian hat, what was taught actually during my education, this is a typical Albanian hat. At that time, it isn't. And this is the reason why the Montenegrins, for instance, are going to introduce the Montenegrin hat. And of course, wearing clothes also sends the message. It conveys the message, particularly between the neighbors, between the people. And I'm asking myself constantly, how are we going to draw a clear line between who is Albanian and who is, Serb, Montenegrin, whatever, because in some cases they're bilingual. And also for them, depending on the context, the confessional loyalty is not the thing. There is other sets of loyalties that are also very important. The Serbs introduced the Serbian hat in their part of the Sanjak after occupying it, of course, because the Slavic-speaking Christians were wearing the fez. And this is problematic for them because are you Muslims or are you Christians? And this is very important to underline. This is a problem for the elites, not the locals, because the locals, they understand what loyalty means, what it signifies. There is an example of one clergyman who became like a abbot of one very important monastery in the borderlands. He traveled to Serbia, and every time the locals are going to say, "You're Turk, you're Turk, you're Turk," and he was offended by it. He was offended because in his understanding, his reading, he wasn't. In some sub-chapters in my dissertation, I analyze very, very, very detailed clothing policies, because through the clothing policies, you also encode certain loyalties and also sends a clear message who is who. And this happens not only among the Muslims, but also among the Christians. Everyone is problematic in the borderlands. Everyone has to be civilized according to the view of the elites.
This is fascinating. I also wanted to ask about that map you put up, which several of us were talking about in the chat and fascinated by. Did you find a lot more maps? Like first, I'm like, wow, I'm really fascinated they put that map out at all. But
the map on revenge?
Revenge map, yeah.
Yeah.
But were there a lot of other kind of maps that you used as sources?
Yes, but not to the extent as Steven Seagal did. I mean, his work, because there is a lot, of course, there is a lot of maps produced by the Serbian elites or preachers of nationalism, also by the Habsburgs, also by certain Ottoman players. But they try also, I mean, to solidify their view of the borderlands, and that's the reason why I couldn't go, I mean, much in detail, because it would take me from my key questions that I wanted to answer. But there is, of course, there is.
Looks like we have a question from Dan. Thank you for answering my questions and responding to my comments, Jovo. Dan?
Always.
Oh, hey, thank you. Jovo, this kind of goes back to Dr. Avramov's original question. And I hope you didn't cover this. If you did, I apologize. But you did talk about corruption, but were there like regions or villages or groups that were notorious for treating this as kind of a profit opportunity?
Of course. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for your question. Of course. I mean, the Draga brothers, because in sources they're going, they realize that this is business. And then you can see also they're going to say, yeah, we are going to obtain 10,000 war volunteers for you. But of course, in return, you need to do something for us. Also, they tried with the Yugoslav authorities. I mean, in the Yugoslav, it was particularly hard to mobilize the locals after 1918 because certain notables are going to say, look, we have been giving soldiers to the Ottoman, Bulgarian, Serbian, Montenegrin, Habsburg soldiers, and now you. There is also certain landscapes that are also very prominent, so to say, in the eyes of the locals, because the locals were also able to nest the Orientalism against each other. I mean, when it comes to the paramilitary, so this paramilitary economy, they're going to establish some paramilitary units, and they're going to, I don't know, exchange some villages, asking, we are going to offer you protection, which is something something not to expect, but this is also cases in Ottoman Macedonia or Ottoman Epirus, also in Anatolia, because in these borderlands, the presence of the state elites was like a ebb and flow. I mean, you have, in some cases, the elites are going to establish a monopoly of violence. In another day, it's going to be changed, and you need to negotiate again. But there is, like I said, Ferhat Bey are only one of the examples.
Thank you very much, Jovo. Dan, would that answer the question?
Oh yes, I just one last little quick question. Were there, and again, I hope you didn't address this previously, but were there guys that were like fighting, like last week they're fighting for one side and next week they're fighting for another? No, of course not. Of course not, because I'm not trying to, in some cases, there is examples of the persons who understand the delicacy of the context in which they found themselves. There is example of Slavic-speaking Slavic-speaking Christian from Ottoman Skopje. He was, prior to the Balkan Wars, the Ottoman soldier. During the Balkan Wars, he became like a Serbian paramilitary. Then he became prisoner of war in the hands of the Habsburg monarchy. And while this Ottoman, I mean, there is other facet of the Ottoman military, Ottoman military, how do I call it? Oh God, recruitment commissions. So besides sending commissions to the borderlands, they also sent commissions to this POW camps, and picking up the persons who are going to join the Ottoman army. And this guy from Skopje, he knew Ottoman Turkish, and he said, "I'm Muslim, I speak Turkish," and he was sent to Istanbul. What I find fascinating, he endured 6 months in the NCO school
He did everything. Then he was sent to Iraq, to the front against the British. The next day, he switched side. He ran to the British side and told, "Look, I'm like a Serbian subject. I was mobilized against my own will." And I mean, the Brits interviewed him, and they shipped him to Thessaloniki, where the Serbian military was located, because during the Habsburg occupation, the Serbian government and military was in Greece. And he participated in the breakthrough of the Thessaloniki front. There is such examples. There is such examples because in order to save yourself, you need to use, certain tactics. But I also wanted to show that it isn't, I mean, today I'm a Ottoman soldier, next day I'm going to be the Habsburg. No, because the context here is very important, because the context is going to gulf these persons. In the case when the Habsburgs are going to track you and also your family, what is the option? Are you going to say no and everything is going to be burned? I mean, and also, for instance, there is examples. So his brother was a Serbian soldier, but he was in the POW camps in the Habsburg monarchy. The Habsburg is asking them, are you going to join our forces? Is he going to say no? Because after he was joined, after joining in, his brother was freed from the POW camps. So it's more than shifting so much easily. Because the context here is important.
In essence, the very, very strong incentives, that's just my insertion, you know, the push and pull factors that I started with. And thank you for reminding. I think it's so important when we deal with the realities of the Balkans, that in fact, context is key to understand. If we take it out of context, then some of the examples might look shocking, you know, or some of the life or trajectories that you're participating. Just, you know, my mind just stuck, you know, like this multiple defections in essence, right? You know, from Istanbul to Iraq, and then, you know, the next day you show up. But there must be a rational explanation as to why you're doing, or not necessarily. When I say must, I be careful with this, but there are rather good explanations as to why those individual behaviors, and at meso level as well. Which meso, I'm thinking the villages that you're talking about, or the larger extended families, as to why they participate in those, in essence, multiple games, you know, like in terms of game theories, you know, when they switch alliances or
take, for instance, the American Civil War as example. It's unbelievably complex. I mean, someone can identify themselves as a Southern, but it doesn't mean that he's going to join the Confederates army, because locality, I mean, the landscape is important for him. And you have, like, I mean, soldiers, not a conscript, but you have soldiers or military units according to the regions. I mean, this is important. Or switching also side and joining the Northern Army. I mean, this is not a peculiarity, of course, to the Balkans. Something is very happening here also when it comes to the German army, also to the soldiers of the German army or the Habsburg army who were captive in Russia.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that God forbid, you know.
No, I understand, and I totally agree with you. Yeah, I totally agree with you. If we understand the context, if we understand the correlation of power, if we understand the dynamics that are at play, we can explain why they change sides, so to say.
Well, then you offered, you know, an additional thing, if I understood very well, you know, this framework into which you were talking about the correlation between elite and masses, and this is very important as well. I mean, this is not unidirectional project, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, someone can identify himself as a Serb, but being a Habsburg soldier. I mean, what's the problem with that? Someone can be, I mean, speaking Slavic or whatever, Serbian, Bulgarian, whatever, but can be fighting for another ideology, which in the eyes of certain governments, this is problematic. But it is problematic for them, not for these people, for instance.
Thank you very much, Jovo.
Can I ask one last question before we go? There's no other. Okay, I'm going to. See, I can just do it because I'm all right. So I guess this is such a complex period. I feel like I could keep talking about this all day, honestly, but which makes me feel like a super history geek. But you know, but But one of the things I'm wondering about is the experience of women, I guess, and children, but most, women on the home front, if there is such a thing, during all of this, as their kind of men were being mobilized here and there. And particularly, I'm interested in the period at the very end of the war, when kind of all hell's breaking loose, and you have the Russian Revolution, and mass starvation across the continent, and mass desertions, and that kind of thing. Like what, and a lot of women's riots across.
I can give you a false example. Of course, for instance, I cannot conceptualize the Montenegrin army without women during the Balkan Wars in the first months of the World War. They were a constituent part of the military, even though the elites tried to separate, which is something, the zeitgeist everywhere. I mean, they try to show that the military is the man thing. Women should not be there. I mean, they cannot be there because, as you said, you need a home front because you're defending home front. Home front means family, means woman, means children, also means motherland. And you, as one who defends the fatherland on the front, you need also to defend motherland because, and they're playing with this, these topoids. What is motherland? What is fatherland? And depending on the context, it's changing. The complexity of women, I mean, participation of women is large. It depends on the region. In some areas, in some landscapes, it was accepted that the woman will be part of the military. This doesn't mean that I'm speaking about the military from the Renaissance period, like woman is in the military and that's it. They are more like moving actors. They're going to spend several days on the front. They're going to bring food when it comes to clothes, and they're going to come back. So they're also carrying the information, what is going on at the front. And this is important for the Montenegrin army, because the elites realize this is like they can boost the morale among the men if they allow the visit of women. And they use that very knowingly. In some cases, when it comes to deserters, elites spend, particularly officers, I mean, they teach and teach right and right about that true men will not flee, will not desert from the military. And then they're going to teach the soldiers' family, it is the duty of women not to help to their men. But this is impossible. I mean, this is impossible. So this is what a colleague here in Berlin calls active immunization. So you are going to add certain symbolic negative meanings to the assertion in order to show, okay, this is it. You're not going to do that. Experience of women is different because we also know, I mean, difference when it comes to the societal background. Those who were educated, they were also very nationalized, but they are not going to frequent to the front. They're going to be, of course, in the home front, taking care of wounded soldiers, whatever. But I could speak of this.
Yes, of course. It's a can of worms. Well, we just want to thank you so much for this talk. Your research is amazing. We're really excited to see all the publications, I'm sure, that are going to come out of this, including a future book, I hope. And we want to have you back at some point to talk, because I feel like we just scratched the surface of everything you know and have uncovered here in this topic. And so thank you so much for sharing it and bringing so much passion to your subject.
Thank you all for your questions, comments, and criticism, and also again, thank you for inviting me to present. I really enjoyed it. And hopefully, you also.
Thank you very much, and again, thank you all for coming to Balkan Circle. We are looking forward towards next week, again, for a very interesting topic, and I really hope that we're going to keep the tone and tempo of today's conversation, as really this season is beginning very, very well. So thank you, Jovo. Thank you, Mary.
We'll see you all next week. We hope.
See you. Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good evening.
You too.
Leka večer.